Despite the gains that can be had from trade, some policies are aimed at reducing trade. The two most common types of trade restrictions that are placed between nations are tariffs and quotas. Tariffs are a tax on imports. The foreign producer is required to pay a tax in order to bring their goods into the country, whereas the domestic producers do not have to pay the tax, giving them a newfound competitive advantage. For example, we might put a tariff on cars imported from Japan. Any cars that come from Japan have to pay the tariff, say $1,000 per vehicle, but any cars produced within the country do not have to pay it. A quota is a limit on the quantity of imports. Unlike a tariff, this one does not typically generate revenue for the government, but it has a similar effect otherwise. For example, we might just put an outright limit on the number of cars that can come from Japan, say 10 million. Once 10 million cars have arrived, we turn back any others. Trade restrictions reduce the number of imports that come into our country, which reduces the foreign competition our producers face. Back in medieval times, cities would often construct castles by the river, not for defense, but to impose tariffs on passing trade ships. The ships had to pay the tariff in order to pass by and deliver their goods. This raised revenues for the town government, but it also protected domestic producers from having to lower their prices to compete. While this is good for the government and for producers, it is at the expense of consumers, or the people who buy the goods and services. No one offered such a blistering critique of trade restrictions as Frederick Bastiat, who sent a satirical petition to the French government in the 1830s after they imposed many new tariffs. Bastiat feigned concern for the poor candlestick makers. He said on their behalf, "We are suffering from the ruinous competition of a foreign rival, who apparently works under conditions so far superior to our own for the production of light that he is flooding the domestic market with it at an incredibly low price. For the moment he appears, our sales cease. All consumers turn to him, and a branch of French industry whose ramifications are innumerable is all at once reduced to complete stagnation." These arguments were as familiar then as they are now. We have to protect our industries and our jobs. But then Bastiat revealed which foreign rival he was talking about. The sun. Bastiat's satire suggested that the French government should require everyone to board up their doors and windows so as to not let any of the sun's light into their home, forcing them to buy more candles. He hoped that the policymakers would see that such a move would be horrible for the welfare of ordinary people. And so too are trade restrictions. After the bubonic plague, long before Bastiat's day, cities across Eurasia were grappling with an economy in turmoil. While wages were high and poverty was down, producers struggled to regain their foothold after the loss in demand. Some towns responded by increasing the tariffs they applied on imported goods from other towns, but some did the opposite. They got rid of their tariffs and saw trade increase to the benefit of all. This would set the stage for some Scottish thinkers to completely rewrite the book on economics. In the time after the plague, advancements in ships led to more trade across Eurasia, and a sort of arms race began. It wasn't just for military power, but for economic power, and by the 17th century, most of Europe was employing some kind of mercantilist system. Mercantilism is an economic policy that is designed to maximize the exports and minimize the imports for an economy. These policies stemmed from a belief that trade was zero-sum and depended on the absolute advantage. Nations believed that if they could attract more gold and silver bullion to their reserves through exports, they would see the wealth of their nation grow. And if you remember our equation for GDP, which has net exports in it, the exports minus the imports, that might make sense. But this effort often had the opposite effects. It is hard to promote exports when everyone is restricting imports. And so many nations turned to colonialism and exploitation to fill their coffers with gold. And while this did make some people in these countries very wealthy, it didn't do much for the typical person, and was clearly awful to the many people who were subjected to the horrors of colonialism. Despite many millennia of backwards economic thinking, slow growth, which was quickly eaten up by a larger population, and a lack of economic freedom, humanity was about to witness an enlightenment that would change the world more than just about anything that had come before it.